Welcome to the XFA Podcast. My name is Lars. I'm CEO of XFA. I'm joined here with Gijs, CTO of XFA. And today we have Stijn Cornelis, the Security Compliance Lead at Infosentry. Very curious, Stijn. Please introduce yourself and explain us, what does a Security Compliance Lead do every day?
Thanks for having me, first of all, in Antwerp. My home base as well, so really close. So I'm the Security Compliance Lead of Infosentry, which means with Infosentry, we're basically a GRC company, so governance, risk and compliance. And we help companies obtaining certain certificates like ISO 27001, but make sure that they're also GDPR compliant, help there with their business continuity plans. And my role as a Security Compliance Lead is mainly to help our consultants that we have gaining the knowledge, gaining the certain certificates, but also doing some sales here and there and doing some demos with certain software that the customer wants to use.
And be on podcasts.
And be on podcasts, yeah. Be the face of the organization sometimes.
Yeah,
Interesting.
that makes sense, yeah.
And so what's new in this space?
NIS2 is a really hot topic, but the same goes for ISO 27001 certificates. A lot of organizations really want to obtain that certificate. If you're in the financial industry, there is new DORA regulations as well. So yeah, our calendar is pretty busy of all of our consultants, but we're happy that our calendar is full actually.
And you say a lot of companies want to be ISO 27001 compliant. What do you see as the main drivers companies have, and is there an increase of companies?
So because of the NIS2 directive, one of the main goals of being NIS2 compliant is by having an ISO 27001 certificate, because you can't get a certificate for being NIS2 compliant. So our organization are always looking for a return on investment, and you get that by having a certificate. So you can go to all your clients and show them, here's our certificate. We cover NIS2 directive with the ISO 27001 regulation. The same goes for questionnaires that companies get. Larger companies get a lot of questionnaires where the questionnaire is actually based on ISO 27001, and companies are really tired of receiving those questionnaires, and they want to basically skip the questionnaire and just give them the ISO 27001 certificate with, of course, their statement of applicability, and go further with that, so they have more time in the other processes.
Yeah, I think these are two very interesting points because I've seen discussions on both topics. So first of all, is ISO 27001 enough to be NIS2 compliant?
Let's say mostly. It's not fully covered, because one of the main topics is management training, which is something quite new. Of course, in ISO 27001, there are some certain controls about awareness, about giving the people the right competences. But in NIS2, there's really a topic about management training, that management needs to be aware of the risks of the organization, that they need to put enough resources towards it. And it's quite new, because it's something that the CCB, the Centrum for Cybersecurity Belgium, is providing certain trainings for, but also private companies are giving trainings towards management. And there's really a gap between ISO 27001 and NIS2.
And so the second part that you mentioned is the security questionnaires. And funnily enough, we saw the compliance officer or risk officer at JP Morgan talking last week, and he actually said it was more about SOC 2 because it's US based, but he actually said SOC 2 is like the minimum bar, and then we're still going to send the security questionnaires. What is your experience there? Do you see, or at least in the Belgian space, maybe do you see less, or do you see with your customers that you get ISO 27000 compliant? Do they see less security questionnaires?
It depends on the industry they're in and the size of the organization, because some small companies send over questionnaires, but they're mainly sending out questionnaires to prove an auditor that they send out questionnaires. But enterprise companies really have the resources to check the questionnaires, and small companies relatively don't have the right time to do so. So for big companies, I think they will still send questionnaires, but the main thing, you can check those questionnaires with your policies and procedures that you have documented regarding ISO 27001. For the smaller companies that send out questionnaires, if you provide them with the list of your certificate or your statement of applicability, they will most likely just check the box and accept your certificate. Of course, just accepting a certificate or a statement of applicability is not right. You should always look into what's the scope of the certificate, because I don't know if you know, but it's relatively easy to say, I'm only going to get an ISO 27001 certificate for my marketing department. You basically decide what scope your organization is covering, but of course you can only do that if you don't have to be NIS2 compliant, because if you need to be NIS2 compliant, then you need to cover the whole organization.
Yeah, and I think that is a very interesting point about the ISO compliance in general, is that you choose your statement of applicability yourself, you choose the scope basically, and I think if as a client of a company that you're going to check their certificates, it is very important to check the details of the certificate, because it's not going to be enough to just say, okay, ISO compliance, fine, we're done. I think there are some interesting things happening in the space as well, and we see GRC tools coming up, a lot of automation in that space, which is great. I think it's making things much easier to maintain that compliance as well. But I think especially around that, security questionnaires, about making sure you can easily verify how compliant a company is, what their scope is. There is a lot of benefit to be gained there in automation and in clear, or at least some kind of standard ways to show that compliance.
Yeah, using those kind of automation tools, one, they're very expensive. For small organizations, they really get like an overwhelming feeling like, wow, it's really expensive. But of course, automation and policies needs to go hand in hand. You can't fully trust an automation tool because otherwise you'll basically fully trust your automation tool, and of course it will get evidences, but you need to make sure that it goes along with your policy and procedure, and you need to review those policies and procedures quite frequently, at least once a year, I assume. And that's why some companies go to talk to me and say like, yeah, I'm just going to use an automation tool because then I'm done with it. I say, fine, that's your choice, but let's come back in a few weeks. I think you will need some policies and procedures as well.
I agree on that point, and especially when scaling up, and it's still about I mean, the main goal of this compliance is still security, right? I mean, you want your company to be more secure, and for that you need some rigor, you need some policies and procedures. It's very correct. But I think using these tools to take away a little bit of the repeatable hassle and things like that, automating that, and then absolutely agree on still making sure you have solid policies and procedures, so that you're ready to scale up if you're a small company, but also as a big company to really have control over that process and not just, again, check the box, I'm ISO compliant, I'm done.
Yeah, for me, getting an ISO 27001 certificate is not to basically automate everything. I fully believe in the automation, but ISO 27001 certificate, or getting an ISO 27001 certificate, is mainly about, one, getting a view of all your risks and improving the maturity of the organization. And automation can help in improving the maturity of the organization, because there you can automate certain things where you don't have time for. You can do access reviews, for example, on different applications, and you can get a report of it. And you can, if you analyze the report, then I'm fully okay with using the tool. But if you just accept it and store it as evidence somewhere in the tickets and putting the ticket to done, then I don't really agree with that.
No. But I definitely think the automation part especially for the gathering the evidence and mapping the evidence to the policies. Because I think you should make the policies manually in many cases. But where, as years ago, it was the case that we just had only policies, and the stack of paper was just completely separate from any like actual security. I feel it's less and less the case, which I think is cool.
I think it's cool as well. The main part of using an automation tool, because we're looking into it as well, is to getting what companies want is to do as less as possible. They want to get the certificate, they want to do it with certain people, but let's say a company usually assigns one person towards the project, and of course they can talk to other people in the company as well. But how can we reduce the workload of that one person so he can focus on checking the policies and checking the policies if they're still in line with the company objectives, but still get to use an automation tool to basically review the evidence that it has gathered. For example, if you're using it for secure development lifecycle, there are a lot of automation tools that check for certain things, but of course the developer needs to be aware on how to use or how to be documenting certain things, having naming conventions, but those are the things that you talk about in your policy. And an automation tool can check like, that's a certain naming convention that is not against the policy, but then the action is not done. The action is getting to talk to the developer that has made a mistake, because it's not really bad to do mistakes, but then he needs to talk to the developer, hold an awareness session, or just say like, hey, be aware of the policy of the secure development lifecycle policy. We have a definition of naming conventions on how to use it, and there you go. So that's how it should be. Seeing the evidence and taking action manually, because taking actions automated is, you can do it for certain things, but not for everything.
Fair. I think that's fair. That's interesting. So going back a bit, if you mentioned NIS2 being a huge driver for ISO, would you say that that's the first step that companies need to do right now? If they fall within the NIS2, is like, for sure get an ISO certification. That's your recommendation, or what? If organizations now notice that they fall between the NIST guidelines, would you say, would you have a different recommendation as a first step?
In Belgium, there are some frameworks that you can use to get NIS2 compliant. One is ISO 27001 with a certain gap analysis and management training, as I said previously. The other part is Siphon. So that's a framework that the CCB has developed themselves. But it all depends on the industry you're in. If you're government, then it's most likely that you will use Siphon framework, because it's basically documented in Belgium. It's really a Belgian framework. But if you're doing international business, someone in Ireland or in Finland doesn't know what Siphon is, and they will take a look at it, but they will still ask you to be ISO 27001 compliant. So, and to get to your question, do organizations need to do that? Well, the first question is, do you need to be NIS2 compliant? Because NIS2 is actually a directive that has been developed as an extension of NIS1. And NIS1 was only for certain sectors relevant, and they made a list of companies that fall under the NIS1 directive. Now there's a NIS2, and now you need to basically sign up yourself to be NIS2 compliant. And you need to do that assessment yourself. Of course, you can ask questions, or you can find a lot of information on the internet, but some organizations still don't know that they will have to comply with NIS2. So that's a gap.
So what will happen? Will it be called up shortly, or?
They have time to register, but first, I think as of recording right now, all the countries still have 15 days to basically make their own description or their first interpretation of the directive themselves. And after those 15 days, you still have some time to register, but you don't have a lot of time to register yourself. And if you don't register, of course, you can still register yourself after a certain deadline, but there could be some consequences, but not in the beginning, of course.
Interesting. And the difference between the ISO certification and the Siphon certification? Is it certification?
Yeah, you can get a Siphon certification.
What's the main difference? Is it cost, or what would you say one is more thorough, or how would you look at it?
For me personally, it's a bit the same. We did a mapping, and there are some controls. I mean, Siphon is a bit more in-depth than ISO 27001, because ISO 27001 says you need to have a password policy, for example. But what's stated in those password policies is up to you. If you use 8 characters, if you use 12 characters, if you use password phrases, that's fully up to you. Siphon is really made against the NIS2 regulation. So there, I think it depends on what you prefer. So the thing is, you can actually get a Siphon certification with your ISO 27001 certification. So you can, if you already have a certification, you can use it. You can just send it over to the CCB with your statement of applicability. You need to basically tell them that you've adapted everything to the Siphon framework and to the NIS2 regulation. And then there is a possibility you need to send them over your audit report. If there are no major or minor non-conformities, you will basically get your Siphon certificate. It's a bit, it's not really fully covered, but that's mainly it.
Interesting. Okay, that's definitely a tip. I think.
Yeah.
We got ISO certified. I think half a year ago. Yeah.
And if someone demands you to have your Siphon certificate, then you can do it that way. And
does that happen?
It's quite new.
Probably.
It's quite new.
Yeah,
So I haven't had any interaction with a company that's going for it, but there is the possibility to do so.
Maybe, so you mentioned a few things that are basically a gap between NIS2 and ISO 27001 certification. Can you go a little bit more into detail? So you said management requirements, certain requirements around management. Mm-hmm. There are some requirements in ISO as well, but
yeah. So indeed, for awareness, for management training, of course, I can give you all the details and all the numbers, but that's not relevant. And there is a control against awareness of employees, and if an employee doesn't have the right competences, they will need to make a plan for that employee to have the right competences. Mm-hmm. Another difference is actually the incident management, where in ISO 27001 there's just the statement that you will need to report to the right authorities, whereas in NIS2 there are some real deadlines, like in the GDPR regulations, stating that you'll need to notify the right authorities within 24 hours or within, and you need to give a report during some time frame. There's no real date for the full report, but those numbers are not really in the ISO 27001 certificate. So what you will need to do is basically look at the timings in the NIS2 regulation and then add it to your own incident response plan.
That makes sense. The deadlines for reporting. So you mentioned earlier, but that was for DORA maybe, the regulation that is there for financial institution. The timings get very short for reporting. How do you see that happening? Is that you mentioned earlier in the conversation we had before, 4 hours to report an incident? That seems awkwardly fast.
Mm-hmm. So in the DORA regulation, after classification, so you receive an incident or you see that there is an incident, you need to classify it as an information security incident or cyber incident, however you want to name it. And then you have 4 hours to notify them for the first time. So it can just be an email, I assume, for, hey, CCB, there is like an incident over here, and they will get notified, and then you're basically compliant. You'll need to give them a few details, of course, but after those 4 hours, you still have some time to basically give them a first part of your report, but they want to be notified for the first time within the 4 hours.
And is that for any type of security incident or only high risk or high?
Currently, it's stated for everything. But for example, I assume that if your employee leaves his laptop unlocked and he's going to the bathroom, and for those incidents, I don't think and I don't agree that you need to notify them. It's more about customer data, for example. Those things you will need to notify them.
And interestingly, I mean, sometimes it takes some time before you actually notice that it's a security incident. You might see the incident. You might see like, okay, something's wrong here, let's investigate and things like that. But it might already take you a day before you actually know, okay, this is really a security incident. Someone broke in or whatever.
So that's why it's stated as after classification.
I see.
because of course you can see it, but you don't know how it has happened or what the actually in what GitHub repository it actually is happening. So after you classify that information, then you will need to notify them for.
I see, that makes sense. And in terms of fines, is it as well defined as in GDPR, or is it?
There are indeed some definitions. I think that the funny part, I think it's funny, is that same goes for in the GDPR, that government or public bodies don't get fined. Where I think, they're just companies as well. They should be fined as well. But yeah, there are some definitions about getting fined.
That makes sense. Okay.
NIS2 has been out there for a while. It's now known. But
there have been different versions indeed. So there's always a first version, then everyone in Belgium can give their comments, then they will have to review those comments and then they adapt it if they think it needs to be adapted, and then you have your final version indeed.
I mean, the last versions were, I would say, quite specific with what needs to be done or what is expected, which is nice, opposed to typical lawyers reading something, writing something down, or legislative texts and stuff. So that's really interesting. So at least that's good. I think they will continue that trend. Europe has been going very strong at the moment with trying to enforce certain things. So very nice.
Yeah, but for some organizations, for example, in the financial sector, it's really a mess for them. Do they have to comply with DORA? Do they have to comply with NIS2? Both, maybe. Some organizations that I helped already want an ISO 27001 certificate. They want to know, is DORA covering everything in ISO 27001? They have a lot of questions. And there is, of course, you can contact the NIS department of the CCB, but they're very busy as well. So it's taking a lot of time and they're getting a lot of questions, but the time to sign up yourself is quite short. So a lot of organizations are questioning themselves, what do we actually need to do?
And that is interesting, right? But I have a few thoughts about that. So indeed, I fully agree that it needs to be kind of clear how these sets of controls are matched, like ISO 27001, NIS to DORA. Is there overlap? Are they, included in each other? Are there extra regulations? Because it seems to me that if you're NIS2 compliant, you should probably also be DORA compliant. Maybe there are some extra specificities for financial institutions. That is fine, but that making that mapping could be very valuable. I suppose CCB might have made one already, or other organizations that might be very useful.
There are indeed different mappings on the internet. I'm using one that I paid for actually because it's really good. But as a small organization, who has time to do that or read through it actually, because the regulation or the directive or NIS2 requirements is so long and not really written in human or in natural language. So they come to us, of course, because we have the knowledge, or we try to have the knowledge, and we basically tell them, we have on our website, for example, a NIS2 assessment tool where you can click on everything and decide on, hey, do we need to be compliant, yes or no? So we try to make it easy for not even our customers, but they can be customers, of course, to tell them if they need to be NIS2 compliant or not.
I think that's super valuable, and I think that is the biggest question for most companies. I mean, for some companies, it would be very clear, like, okay, well, I'm going to be, if you're an energy company, it's pretty clear that you're going to be going to have to be NIS2 compliant. But if you're, for the companies that are on some
infrastructure and moving down to the supply line, it gets more difficult.
Exactly.
And indeed, even those smaller companies that don't directly have to fall under the NIS2 regulation, it's possible that their suppliers or their bigger customers give them those requirements, and then they have to be, for example, NIS2 compliant as well, not by regulation, but by questionnaires by customers.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think, and especially what you mentioned with the mapping that you mentioned or you paid for, about mapping all the different certifications and the controls to each other, I think is interesting. Of course, they all evolved separately from each other, but I found, of course, every certification kind of has these same pivotal points that they focus on, and I think especially automation tools like the GRC platforms, DORA Pass Fund, they really focus on this. Of like, okay, this check, these tests, let's automate them. I think that's really cool.
The same goes for XFA, for example. There are a lot of control that you can cover with using XFA, and that's why we are personally a fan of using XFA.
Nice.
Because you have the nice dashboards, you get those notifications, and you have employees begging you to get access again because their device is not ready or not compliant with the policy. So using tools really helps you as an organization, but the foundation should be policies and procedures, and then you can use policies.
Yeah, but it's still, and thank you by the way, but it's still indeed how these certifications are written sometimes that give an idea about how it should be, and that's still, it's still an exercise to map them, because ISO is not quite clear on it, but they're like, okay, you should manage the risk around devices, but then that can basically mean anything. Then you have SOC 2 that's way more explicit. You should be able to protect that's not actually what it says, but it's way more specific about, okay, the data should not leak from the device. We should make sure that it stays on it. And they can go to things like disk encryption or remote wiping. And we focus heavily on, hey, let's do disk encryption because it's something you can completely control. But then there's, we want to remotely wipe the device. Is that a requirement? And you get these interesting interpretations of a certification. And I think that's very interesting.
Yeah, same goes for SOC 2. You have a lot of evidence, because that's the reason why most organizations prefer or have a SOC 2 certification, because customers or other people require you to have a lot of evidences. For ISO 27001, you need certain evidences. For example, your password policy has been reviewed. You have a ticket for that in Jira, for example, where it shows. But for SOC 2, the evidence is key for getting this certification. And for an audit, of course, because there's always an internal audit or an external audit when you're doing an ISO 27001 certification, or mainly any certification, he's not covering everything. He's covering 2 or 3 tickets during an audit program, or he's looking at certain things, but he can't cover everything. So having a certification doesn't really mean that you're fully compliant or that you're fully ready or your whole organization is secure. No, there's an auditor that has been conducted that indeed you're safe for the control that he saw and for the control that he checked and the evidence that he saw. So that's why getting your certification is one thing, but maintaining the certification really helps you, because I'm currently also helping organizations that have been helping, or that have been getting their certification for, I think one is having his certification for 8 years. So you really see the improvement after 8 years, that they're really onto that stuff, and they're really building a management system that is not separate from the organization, but the main goal is to having a management system that really incorporates in the organization. And if you have done that, then I think you're secure enough.
But I think it's a very good point. It's all about time and history, and about repeating things. And when we are comparing these frameworks as well, we should not forget that ISO 27001 already exists for many years and has had revisions over that time, learning from how it happened in real life. And that's also why I think it's actually interesting that here in Belgium, CCB actually comes with a new kind of framework, Siphon. It kind of makes sense to map it closer to NIS2, but it also doesn't make sense that much, because you already have these frameworks. Now the question is not how do DORA, NIS2, and ISO 27001 map, but also how does Siphon map on that? And you have all these certifications and all these regulations that mapping becomes hard. And it makes sense, that you have, like, for example, Europe and the US, and that there are some differences, but basically all these things try to achieve the same, right? And I think mapping it out, that's what I said earlier, is a very crucial part. But also, and I think GDPR is also a very good example of that timing. And where GDPR, when it came out, companies also didn't know what to do. They were also like, okay, do we have to do this? How does this work? Do we need tooling to do this? But tooling didn't exist at the time. And now, since 2018, it's already like 6 years, right? Things evolved and companies are getting much more compliant with GDPR because they now understand better how to implement it. They've been reviewing it over time. And that's exactly what you're saying as well, right? Is that if you've been compliant for 8 years, hopefully, and that is also the goal of that certification, you get more secure and you get more out of that compliance. And I think that is very powerful. And we should also not forget that while we're implementing NIS2 and DORA, that we're just at the start, right? It didn't even start it really, right? And if we're going to look back at this point in a year or 2 years, we're going to see like a lot of companies got more compliant. And I think another point that I want to make is it's a discussion that we have a lot with American colleagues and friends, is that for them, they see the EU as usually over-regulating and putting too many regulations in place. I don't say I don't fully agree with them. I think sometimes EU does over-regulate. But I think GDPR is an example of the power of that regulation sometimes. I'm not saying that everything in the GDPR is great and that everything is has its reason to exist, but at least it got companies to be more aware of privacy.
Yeah, thoughtful, yeah.
And I think we're going to see the same for more general security by having NIS2 and DORA. And yes, it's complicated now. And yes, there are a lot of questions and companies don't know what to do. But this is going to be improve over time. And I'm looking forward to that point where companies are going to be more secure. And it's also a hard statistic to get, but I assume that incidents will go down. Not necessarily that they go away, obviously not.
But people know how to handle those incidents.
Yeah, and we'll see companies being more secure. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I think that's somewhat an exciting future.
As you said, we're still at the starting point because for GDPR, for example, it was launched in 2016, but in 2018 it became mandatory. And in 2016, of course, I was still studying, but Infosentry, the company, exists longer. We were waiting for the customers to come. And we're like, they'll come because the GDPR is out now. They need to be compliant. We'll wait and they'll come to us. But they actually didn't came at all. They actually came in 2018. Then it became mandatory, and then everyone came towards us, and workload was here, was really on top. And yeah, so it's quite normal that most companies are still waiting, are still reading through the regulations, are hold back and waiting for getting the deadline. And when the deadline is there, then everyone will start getting compliant.
But it kind of makes sense for the same reason. For the same reason that I'm mentioning, people don't know what to do. If you're investing a lot of time now, you're basically kind of investing time in inventing how to be compliant. Well, if you wait, I'm not saying you should wait as a company, just make sure you're compliant. But it, like I said, it kind of makes sense. It will get clearer. There will be more tools and information available to get compliant.
I kind of agree, because once the fines are out, then companies are like, oh damn, this could happen to me as well. And then the fines there's a description, of course, on why they were fined, and then organizations will trigger, all right, we're actually doing the same thing. We should actually change it before we will get a fine. But of course, there is a deadline, and after that deadline, there's a possibility you get fined. I don't think for those smaller companies that they will get fined immediately. They're most likely going after the big guys first, the big enterprises, and then afterwards they will, if there is an incident, then they will look into your organization. But the same went for GDPR. The smaller companies, they didn't get fined until now, and so they're 2018, I think, until now, as you said, 6 years. Now smaller companies are getting fined, but still the bigger ones, of course. And now they indeed see on the reason on why they should do it, because there is no return on investment for companies. It's just mandatory, and the return on investment is actually not getting fined.
Yeah, I agree. And yeah, GDPR is a good example. At the time, I was CISO at DPG Media, so we were working a lot on GDPR as well, and kind of the main incentive was, it's not a small company, and if in Belgium there is a company that's going to be set as an example, it might be a company like that. So it was, although I don't think it's the right incentive necessarily, it was the incentive. It was like, okay, we just have to make sure we're not the one getting fined.
But then again, DPG Media had the resources to do so. Smaller companies are building their organizations, same for XFA, of course. You're first trying to get your product on the market and that it is successful. Of course, XFA is taking into consideration different security measures.
As a security company,
you always do that. I hope so. But for example, your finance or your local bank who has different employees, it's possible that they fall under DORA regulations, but they're waiting for their higher ups. For example, your local ENG company, they're still waiting for higher up in ENG to make the policies for them. So it's logical that they wait.
But I do get also, like, from public and like from end users, the hate that GDPR receives. If you surf the web now and you get all the cookie banners, it's difficult, or I find it sometimes difficult to explain what the real upside is now. And if you get into a long conversation, it's very clear. It's like everybody has to be honest right now. That's the whole gist. Everybody has to be honest what they collect and what they use it for, and they can't sell or they have to tell you your information anymore. And this was mainly targeted at some big companies who did some shady things. Cool, clear. But over I find, like, over a casual drink, it's like, all these cookie banners, and it messes with websites and everything. And that's how I think many people registered their first experience with GDPR, or that's not allowed, that's not allowed, that's not allowed. While it's actually, no, everything is allowed, or kinda everything is allowed. Non-shady things, of course, not. But you just have to be honest about them. I think that's an interesting.
And there needs to be consent, of course. Or
consent,
there
are
different things you can give consent about. But I agree. I think, but there needs to be alternatives. For example, I think it was a year or maybe 2 years ago, there was really some backlash on Google Analytics, for example, because in the dashboards you could see on how they transfer data, and it was not okay to use Google Analytics a few years ago. I think you don't need to use it right now, but there were no alternatives. So people kept using Google Analytics for getting the analytics on their website. And now you see more and more GDPR compliant or companies that have been developed in the EEA, the European Economic Area, that provide good alternatives to Google Analytics. But the bigger companies have the bigger resources, have the bigger capabilities, so they get more data. So, but I'm seeing a shift in using Google Analytics or other alternatives instead of Google Analytics. So I think that's...
And we see a shift in how Google Analytics operates. And I think that is the real goal, right? Is making these companies responsible, or at least thinking about privacy to, incorporate some of that into their tools. It's probably still way too privacy invasive, but the latest version of Google Analytics made a lot of changes to actually comply more or better with the GDPR.
But same. Of course, it needs to be, sometimes organizations use it for marketing purposes, and then of course it's a bit, you need to read through the lines if they're doing it for marketing purposes or they're actually caring about privacy. Because, for example, Nessus had a lot of incidents a few months back, and they're now adding certain features that basically tell you as a user, like, hey, Nessus is now clear, we patched everything, here are some new features. But if you read between the lines, they released like an air-gapped backup system. I don't know if you read about it. But you basically now connect to a router, or the connection with air-gapped is actually with the router and your local backup system, and there is only a connection with a router and with the separated backup NAS if there is a backup needed. But yeah, connecting to a router for a backup is not really a security feature, I think.
And it also isn't really air-gapped.
No, indeed. So they're providing new features for marketing purposes to cover their backlash in the previous months. So that's why I'm not a fan of those things, and I'll always read between the lines of those features.
Somebody read an article for air-gapped. That sounds nice, and then
Yeah.
It's interesting, but I mean, I find like in the last years, I think Apple is a very good example of this actually. In a good way, a lot of companies have made it a value that they strive for privacy. We actually have the same. We say, okay, we think device security should be done in a privacy respecting way. But I think especially Apple is a good example where they actually are still, I wouldn't say fighting, but in talks with, for example, EU, if they want to roll out certain features, as you actually have a discrepancy now, big ones, between how certain pieces of software operate in certain markets. That they say, hey, purely on the payment methods that you have connected or like the geographic location that you are, your device will do different things instead of you have access to certain content which is outside of your. And I find that really interesting. So in a way, it's really affecting in positive and negative things depending on the scenario, how companies are operating. So that's cool.
Yeah, I agree. For example, with I think it's iOS 18 now, with Apple Intelligence not being launched in the EU, I think that's a great example of first wait and see how the product's working, talk with the regulators, how can we do that in the EU. But at the same time, if I'm in America, I'm thinking like, why is it rolled out over here? If there is GDPR in Europe, am I going to use it? Yes or no? Of course, you can toggle it on and off. But yeah.
But I think usually the other way around is, or it's more like, look at these people in the EU not being able to use these new features. I mean, it's interesting, and yeah, I think GDPR also had an impact in the US for sure. There are a lot of privacy regulations that came out in different states in the US as well. So yeah, it has an influence, but the perception of privacy is somewhat different between the US and Europe, and it has to do partially with regulation, but also with just culture. And yeah, I don't know if I fully agree with what you're saying there. Is it gonna let US citizens think more about privacy? I'm not sure.
But that's because I'm from Europe, and if I'm in the USA, then I'm going to think that way. But in America, it's normal. So they will not. I think they will not think like that.
But I heard the same thing about food actually. Maybe a weird conversation, but like the same thing. Hey, this can't be sold in the EU. Then you would think that's weird. You know, they have the bread is a good example. Very different in very much locations in the world. And I was like, okay, why not? And it gives interesting. So I can definitely see that happen. Of course, culture in the US and Europe is very different on the front. But I find it interesting. Previously, if you would buy a new phone, a new device, it would be small things that it's volume, for example. Volume is regulated in the EU much more, or it would be antennas that would be in the device. Certain ones would be turned off, or the amount of energy that you could put through it. But now it's full front-end features. I find that really interesting, and you see that, there is certainly a case of over-regulations, over-regulation that happens, but I find it really interesting and quite bold. I think it has some positive impact, definitely.
Definitely,
But it also goes back to the cookie banners, right? You see that differences in the US, you don't get them if they can detect well that you're in the US. But and I mean,
do you hate cookie banners?
I do hate them. Yeah, of course. Everybody does. I mean, I really think they are breaking the internet as it exists now. I'm not against the intention of why we put them there, and I fully agree what you said earlier on. The transparency is super important, that companies become more transparent about what they do. But I think cookie banners in general it's also not only GDPR, it's actually our e-privacy that talks about that as well. and there is some misinterpretation in the implementation of that. That's because lawyers had to explain to developers how to do that, and then I don't know, there became kind of a mismatch on what exactly do you need to ask and show, and how granular has that to be, and things like that. I mean, and that's also you also see that between websites. Some websites do it completely different than others, and I don't know, it's a whole mess, and I think they should do something about that as well. I kind of forgot my point, but the main thing is here that the regulations are important, and I do believe in what we're trying to achieve with the regulations. I do think it's important that that these differences that are there now between US and Europe are because of these regulations, and it's not always a bad thing. But I think finding that balance is going to be super important in the future, as well as how can we continue stimulating innovation and new things. Another great example is the USB-C connector for phones. It's in general, it's great at this point, right? I mean, that you have the same connector and the same charger for every phone. That it sounds great. But the question is again, and I think it's not a bad argument from the counterpart, is like, yeah, but are you not gonna stifle innovation on connectors? And finding that balance is extremely hard. I'm not saying that I'm fully against the regulation on that, but I think it's going to be important to balance, and I'm afraid that the EU sometimes forgets to balance it. I'm also thinking about AI regulation and stuff like that are coming out, like, again, for good reasons. I mean, they're using information that maybe should not be used to train models and things like that. But there is becoming a very large discrepancy between what happens on AI in the US in comparison with what happens in the EU. And it's going to be a question in the long run if that is for the better for Europe or for the US. And yeah, I have my doubts about that.
But that's why they have like a window of implementing it and getting fined, basically, because that window gives the organization time to really think about the regulation, one thing, but again, telling the authorities like, hey, we don't agree with what you stated over here because X, Y, Z. So, but I fully agree, because the AI Act is there quite fast. The regulation has been defined really quickly, and now they need to adapt. And as you said, USB-C is really great, but the innovation could be way better. I don't know. I'm not an expert on connectors. I can't tell you anything about it. But I fully agree with that. There needs to be room, or there needs to be, I mean, for AI Act, there is like a sandbox environment where new AI models can be tested. And I think that's really great for AI Acts being developed, but you can use it in a sandbox environment, and then they can test it, and then they can approve it. But what about connectors indeed? You can make one, you can submit it, I assume, but is it going to be rejected, or does there need to be a new law that provides it? But
it's interesting, you probably can submit connectors, again, also not an expert on connectors, but the thing about connectors is all about adoption, right? And your adoption is never going to be high if you're not going to be approved as a standard and things like that. So it's very interesting. A funny thing that I saw on social media yesterday, I think, was a startup founder discussing something on the internet with someone else about our privacy policy or terms and conditions. I forgot which legal document. I GDPR'd that. It's no way. I have no time for legal now. Founder mode, something like that, right? It's like, and it's interesting, right? And I think it's a funny thing. Obviously, first question is like, no, you should really put some effort in, at least, your legal documents and stuff like that. These are there for a good reason. But it comes back to that discussion, right? If you have overregulation as a startup, something we mentioned earlier as well, is you really have to invest a lot of time in that as well, and effort. And especially if you're on the forefront of technologies, on AI, on whatever other technologies, you not always have the time and the resources to invest in like reading all these regulations and things like that. Obviously, you can get help and things, but it is a difficult thing. And I think on that point, I sometimes agree a bit more with the US side of things. It's like, okay, you also want to stimulate innovation. And again, finding a balance between both worlds would be great. I think it's a very hard thing to do. I'm not sure we're going to get there at any point, but it's important, I think.
I agree, me neither. And I think, but the difference, I find it quite difficult in the US that each state can have their own GDPR regulation, or it's a bit of the same as in Europe. So because Belgium has their own translation of the GDPR, and the Netherlands has its own translation, but in the US it's one country. Everyone talks the same language. Everyone's using the same software, not that case, but the same governance software. So if you're moving from one state to another, there's a whole different regulation, and there's a balance there as well. That's I think it first needs to be fully US adapted for the whole US. I don't know if that's possible. For example, the HIPAA regulation, and then we can solve a match between Europe and the US.
Yeah. I think I absolutely agree. Regulation in the US is also kind of a mess. Regulation in general is a mess. I mean, it's also not surprising, right? I mean, people who are not necessarily experts in the field, any field, have to make kind of rules around it. And I'm not saying they're not getting help from experts and things like that, but at some point you have to like structure this in a framework that, and anyway, once you have a law, there's always going to be friction, right? There's always going to be companies that are going to be on, I don't know, the border of that law or trying to break out of that law. And I think that's always going to be the reality.
And yeah, it's actually also, I'm making a bridge here, but with all those regulations, for us, for example, as a GRC company, it's quite difficult to find employees that have the knowledge of those regulations or those frameworks, because in Belgium there is not really a study department or something that you can study to be a GRC employee. And then we need to find people in legal, we need to find people in business, we need to find people in technology to get the knowledge of those certain frameworks, to get the knowledge of everything, to help our customers. And having so many regulations in so many different fields and not really having junior profiles is quite difficult to help everyone, because we're also still studying the AI Act, for example. What is happening over there? What is happening over there? Which AI model is compliant? Which AI model isn't? Which do we need to help? So yeah, everywhere it's
yeah, I think it's interesting because you're just on that sweet spot of where everything comes together, right? Legal and business and security and IT and you kind of have to like make sure that all these parts play together nicely, and it is a very difficult thing to organize within a company. And so as Infosentry being, you try to be the help for that organizing that part, and that seems extremely difficult, and finding right people.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah.
But bringing it back indeed to we talked about regulation and big companies. What would you say from your experience? You've helped a lot of clients. Is the most difficult thing for the average company that you help to get under control?
Communication between the different departments, actually.
Fair.
Because most companies think that the IT department is responsible for dealing with that, or the compliance department is really working towards it. But actually it covers also HR department. It also covers the suppliers, that is managed by the procurement my procurement company or department. So getting the knowledge of everyone and getting awareness towards the whole company that everyone is responsible is quite difficult.
Do you have tips on that?
tips, awareness is one tip, but how do you do it is holding sessions that are really relevant for your department. Some organizations, as ISO, for example, requires you to do, is just giving an awareness presentation. But if you just give an awareness presentation, yeah, you can say like, hey, this is our password policy. Hey, this is our logical access policy. People will sleep. If you make awareness presentations specifically for your department and stating, for example, hey, if you're doing procurement, there's now a procurement checklist that we will need to follow with information security requirements here and there, and you're just giving it to that department, then they will know what they need to do and then they will do it. But if you give that to the whole company, or for example, 50% of the company, yeah, me neither. When I was a student, and it's not relevant for me, I'm not following it, and I'm sleeping basically. And again, it's quite simple. But doing a quiz, I know people hate it, but
It's awkward.
You can really see in your organization, all right, which department has the right competences, has the knowledge of the policies that we've provided them with. So, and which departments have not, and do we need to give another awareness session about, or talk with the department manager, for example. So really specifying an awareness presentation for a niche group or your department, I think helps.
Very nice. And do you like the approach of having champions in every team, that are not their main focus is GRC, but they just kind of are a fan, or you try to make them a fan? Or do you see, as let's call a mid-sized company, would you recommend them to have like a separate department to manage their risk and compliance?
Yes, but for risks it's a bit different than for policies and procedures. So for risks, what we prefer to do is defining risk in two different ways. You can do it by process, or you can do it by scenario. So for process, for example, you have your recruitment process, and then you do your business impact analysis, and you decide, okay, this is a risk, we need to do some treatment, and then you have your HR responsible or your recruitment responsible, who will then know what he needs to do. So I agree that the managers need to be informed and need to be the owner of the risk and need to take accountability for it. Having random employees in a company tell them like, hey, you need to be responsible for GRC right now, don't think that works, because employees think it's an honor to do so, but if they're not trained for it and they don't want it to do, then they still need to do it, and they do it at Friday at 4 p.m. It's actually Friday 4 p.m. The open bar is happening. They will forget about it and they will not do it.
Maybe put posters in the open bar.
They will do posters at the open bar, but if you're not fully committed to it, then nothing will happen, or you will do it at your last minute.
Cool. Great tip. I think that's a great one to end on. Thank you for joining us, for sharing all your GRC knowledge, and hope to see you again.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Well, that was it. Feel free to follow Infosentry and Stijn Cornelis on LinkedIn, and of course XFA as well. And see you next time. Bye.